Finally, Yu sat across from the guy her sister was interested in. After a brief conversation, Dogok tapped the table with a card, drawing Yu's gaze. He casually told her they should meet at the hotel later. Yu was stunned by his audacity and laughed to herself. Though she'd heard rumors that Dogok was arrogant, she hadn't expected him to be worse than those whispers. Dogok continued, saying he had also heard rumors about her. He understood she wasn't one of the easy ones. He smirked, remarking that Yu was actually quite the entertaining conversationalist. Immediately, Uppal joined in, rosing from the sofa. Front showed up convinced Uppal's math skills and completed their task. Uppal grinned and said it was just a meeting. Uppal raised an eyebrow and questioned whether he always had to be so direct. Uppal grinned and said it wasn't so bad, after all. Yu stared at him. "I figured this was a test the moment we met," she said coolly. "I'm not a fan of guys who flash a room key as their first move." Dogok, taken aback, tried to recover. He muttered that trusting his future to the woman who made him use that key on their first meeting didn't seem like a terrible idea. He met Yu's judgmental gaze, but couldn't read her expression. Yu stood up. "I'm sorry, but I don't think I fit into the future you're imagining," she said. Dogok, unfazed, wished her luck. Yu sighed deeply, deciding it was time to head home. Just as she turned to leave, she heard a familiar voice behind her. She spun around to see Yura standing there, with Seok at her side. The sight of them together made Yu's stomach churn. The reality of her memories hit her all at once. She froze. Yu knew she had to act, to show her sister that she was stronger. Without thinking, she turned back to Dogok, staring him down. "Only one round for this test, right?" At that moment, Yura noticed her sister in the cafe, her eyes widening as she saw Yu sitting with Dogok. She could hardly believe what she was seeing. Meanwhile, Dogok was confused by Yu's cryptic statement. "One round? What do you mean?" he asked. Before Yura could approach, Yura leaned forward, grabbed Dogok by the collar, and kissed him. His eyes shot wide open in shock. Across the cafe, Yura and Sok stood frozen, utterly bewildered by what they were witnessing. Yura's face twisted from one of joy to one of disbelief and anger. Dogok, still processing the situation, suddenly realized that he was enjoying it. He reached out, cupping Yu's face as he deepened the kiss. Yu's eyes fluttered open, surprised by his reaction, but she didn't pull away. Until she finally remembered why she had started this in the first place. She broke away abruptly, wiping her lips in embarrassment, avoiding his gaze. Dogok blinked, still dazed, trying to comprehend why Yu had stopped. Just then, Yura marched over, her expression stiff. What are you doing here, Mr. Dogok So?" she stammered. Sok greeted Dogok, clearly just as surprised. Yura forced a smile and said it was quite the coincidence to run into Yu and Dogok here. Yu, turning to face Yu, simply asked what she was doing there with Sok. Before Yura could answer, Yura turned back to Dogok and smiled. "Dinner tonight?" she asked, teasingly handing him the room card. Dogok smirked. "I think that sounds like a good idea." Yura and Sok exchanged confused glances as they watched Yu and Dogok continue their strange flirtation. Dogok took the card from Yu, and they both smiled at each other, leaving Yura fuming. The scene shifted to the hotel room. Dogok explained that it wasn't a suite, just a business room. He sighed and said, A business room. The number of women that have ever made it this far before. The number of..." Yu interrupted, apologizing for the earlier kiss. She told him he was free to report it to Yura if he wanted to. Dogok chuckled, wiping his lips. What are you talking about? He asked. It wouldn't be as fun if we played by the rules. He leaned back, asking why you really wanted to meet him. You paused, then answered, because of the wedding. Dogok looked puzzled. Is there any other reason for a blind date? Yura turned away. Yura seems to like you, she said quietly. She turned back. Dogok raised an eyebrow. Is that why you wanted to marry me? Bean met her own reflection in the window. At first I thought it was about you, but now I'm thinking about starting a company. She turned back to face him, her eyes hard. I know about your grandfather's condition for investing. The condition is marriage. Once you get married, he'll let you start a venture. Dogok stared at her, processing her words in silence. You, sensing his hesitation, asked, What do you think about that? Dogok smiled, surprised by how well she knew his circumstances. Interesting, he muttered, his eyes narrowing. You talk like you know the future. Yu's phone suddenly vibrated, breaking the tension. Dogok glanced at it. Yu checked the caller. Yura. She immediately rejected the call. Dogok frowned. Why didn't you answer? Before she could respond, another call came in. It was Sok this time. Yu rejected it again and shrugged. Doesn't matter. Yu set her phone down and asked Dogok, What are your plans for tonight? She glanced up. If you're free, we could spend the evening together. Then she felt his weight on her shoulder. Dogok's eyes widened, caught off guard. Wait, you saying we should sleep together? How? He burst out laughing, unable to contain himself. Jude stood there, puzzled, realizing too late the double meaning of her words. Flustered, she covered her face with her hand. Dogok, still chuckling, leaned forward, asking, What exactly are you after, are you? A fake marriage, perhaps? I don't think I ask for much. He stared at her curiously. And what do I get out of this deal? The girl didn't know how to respond, and Dogok kept pressing her, asking what if he chose Yi over her. What was the difference? He asked her to prove that she was worth it, or maybe she could charm him enough for him to fall in love with her. U silently stared into his eyes, trying to think of something to say. However, she found herself amused by how similar Dogok was to her. It was entertaining. After a pause, U silently stood up and walked to the wine cabinet, deciding that wine might help them figure things out. She opened a bottle, poured a glass, and handed it to Dogok, remarking that if she were him, she would have bought Nova Games instead of investing in hotel keys. Dogok was surprised by her comment, as he hadn't realized her interest in his business. He asked if she heard that from his manager, to which Yu responded by asking if he was the type of person who immediately ran to a supervisor when special issues came up. Dogok smiled, intrigued by her thoughts. Yu shouted. They continued drinking, and after a while the bottle was empty. U, tired, fell asleep in bed. Later she stirred, turning over and opening her eyes, only to be startled to find Dogok sleeping beside her. Even in his sleep he looked handsome. But then she noticed something. Her lipstick mark on his neck. Shocked and horrified, she started piecing together the events of the night. She had found Dogok's lip mark. She remembered them drinking together, her removing her coat and then throwing herself at him, saying she wanted to sleep. The memory made her blush. Deciding she needed to leave before Dogok woke up, she tiptoed around the room. But when Dogok shifted in his sleep, she jumped in fright, thinking he was awake. However, he remained asleep, much to her relief. Smiling at how handsome he looked even now, she left some money on the table to cover the cleaning costs and slipped out. As Yu drove away, her expression showed no sign of joy. Eventually, she arrived at her destination, her grandfather's hospital room. Upon entering, she saw him hooked up to an IV. He was surprised to see her and immediately took her hand, apologizing for everything. He told her she was his only granddaughter, repeating the apology over and over, with tears in his eyes. Yu felt a deep guilt. 3 months earlier, her grandfather had passed his entire inheritance to Ura, and Ura knew she needed to verify his words. She glanced around the room and saw his toothbrush, deciding to take it with her. As she reached for it, the door opened, and Ura entered, addressing their grandfather. Ura smiled warmly at him, calling herself his granddaughter, and then started tending to him. Ura turned to Yu, remarking that she lacked respect for her elders and scolded her for not answering the phone yesterday. Yu sighed but pulled herself together, smiling confidently. She told her mother she was on a date last night. Her mother's eyes widened in shock as she asked if the date was with Dogok from the sogging group. Yu laughed and confirmed it, though she wondered how her mother knew. Ura had mentioned it earlier. Yu smiled slyly, saying there would be good news soon. Meanwhile, at Dogok's office, a meeting was underway about the sales of the new game Golden Eye, which had increased by 22% in the first quarter. Despite the discussion, Dogok's mind wasn't on sales. He was still thinking about Yu. Her actions from the night before had puzzled him, especially the money she left behind with a note to cover cleaning and breakfast. As he reflected on her strange behavior, Dogok couldn't help but remember Yu's tipsy state the previous night. She had been talking, and whenever he turned away, she would yell at him, asking if he was paying attention. Rather than being annoyed, Dogok found it funny. Yu had summed up her life in a monologue, laughing at the absurdity of it all. Then, out of nowhere, she asked Dogok if he could see memories. Dogok, staring at the floor, said he could. Yu had averted her gaze, confessing that there wasn't a single moment in her life that had truly hooked her. She asked Dogok how that could be, but he didn't have an answer for her. Frustrated, Yu had sighed and declared that this time it had to be different. Then, to Dogok's surprise, Yu suddenly got up, announcing she was going to bed. Dogo considered. Dogok was caught off guard by the abrupt change in conversation, especially when Yu started undressing. He tensed up, asking what she was doing. Feeling embarrassed, he tried to stop her from undressing, but she protested, screaming at him not to touch her. Dogok was trying to calm her down when he realized she still had a dress on under her coat. Relieved, he tried to compose himself, but Yu, in her drunken state, tripped over a chair and fell toward him. In a split second, Dogok couldn't catch her, and they both ended up on the bed. Yu, already half asleep, pressed herself against him. Dogok was left bewildered, his heart racing. He realized how much he liked her being close, but was also embarrassed by the situation. After a while, Yu rolled over to the other side, giving Dogok a chance to finally stand up. As he looked down at the sleeping girl, Dogok noticed something strange. A license plate on her hands caught his eye. He recognized the inscription. Looking at her, he whispered to himself that he didn't want to remember certain moments from his past either. Stroking her hair, Dogok promised himself that this time, things would be different. The scene shifted back to Dogok's office. It was already 10 a.m., and he hadn't received any calls from Yu, despite her mention of the wedding the day before. Just then, an employee interrupted Dogok's thoughts, asking if he was thinking about work or something else. The employee handed Dogok a tablet, congratulating him. On the screen was a news story titled, "Tycoon So Good," featuring a picture of Dogok and Yu. Immediately he started scanning the article, asking if it was about the second son of Sun Group. The guy responded that this wasn't the most important news at the moment. He warned the director that because of the criticism and scandal, the company could suffer losses. Suddenly, Dogok noticed the author of the article. It was his favorite cousin, Soo Jan-non. After turning off the tablet and handing it back, Dogok asked if his assistant had contacted the girl. The assistant confirmed that he had and leaned in to share something even more interesting. He had found out that Dogok and the girl had gone to the same elementary school. Dogok asked if this meant they had a close relationship. The assistant clarified that they didn't, as they hadn't gotten along during that time. Dogok sighed, recognizing this as typical of Soo Janan, and immediately asked his assistant to bring the reporter to him. The assistant hesitated and nervously asked if Dogok was planning to sleep with another girl. These words amused Dogok, and a smile spread across his serious face. A moment later, he burst out laughing, leaving the assistant bewildered. Suddenly, Dogok stood up, grabbed his jacket and started walking out. The secretary, confused, asked where he was going. Dogok turned, smiling, and said he was running away. Just as he reached the door, his assistant's eyes widened in fear, realizing it was too late. Someone was already there. The woman stood behind Dogok and asked where he was going. Turning in horror, Dogok greeted her sweetly, asking if she had arrived already. The woman, growing suspicious, asked if Dogok was planning to get married. He nervously confirmed, avoiding eye contact. The woman, frustrated, reminded him that he always avoided looking her in the eye when she asked that. Dogok sighed and admitted that even his father didn't know about it. This revelation shocked the woman, who demanded to know more. Dogok turned to his secretary and asked him to explain his nickname. Surprised, the secretary quietly explained that Dogok was asexual, had no sex drive, and was impotent. The woman was taken aback, utterly shocked by what she was hearing. Dogok smiled, explaining that he had lived with this condition his whole life and had to prove it to people. The woman, still in disbelief, asked if this was why Dogok wanted to get married. Dogok, seemingly unbothered, asked her why she had married his father, even though he already had a wife. In a fit of frustration, the woman slapped him, calling him a rude child. Dogok, stunned, watched as the woman angrily walked towards the elevator. Before she could leave, Dogok grabbed her arm and turned her around. He confidently told her that he would reclaim his father's company and win back both his father's love and his grandfather's legacy. The woman, unsure whether to believe him, asked what he meant. Dogok smiled sweetly, assuring her that he would make it happen. The scene shifted to a beautiful beach. Yu was on the phone, being asked where she had disappeared to. She calmly replied that she was at the beach, which shocked the person on the other end, who exclaimed that she must be crazy. Yu then confirmed that she was going to marry Dogok Ao. The friend on the phone, laughing, asked why she should help her. Yu sighed, hinting that she knew about her friend's secret relationship, which made the friend spit out her coffee in shock. The friend, panicking, asked how Yu knew. Yu reassured her that she wasn't following her, but added that the guy she was seeing had a pregnant girlfriend. The friend, horrified, asked if this was true, but Yu tried to downplay the situation. As the conversation continued, Yu suddenly spotted someone and abruptly ended the call. "If you think I'm lying, try and act out the conversation." Dogok stood in front of her, having finally found the girl who had been on his mind. He asked why she had stayed by the sea, admitting that he hated the beach. Ah avoided the question, asking why he had been looking for her. Dogok explained that she hadn't answered his calls, and that he wanted to return the money she had left. Yu, confused, told him there was no need to return anything. Dogok sighed, explaining that it was unusual for someone to leave a note and run away. Yu, taken aback by his confidence, jokingly asked if he had run out of money. Dogok smiled and admitted that he had suffered a loss, a significant one. He then reminded her that she had mentioned the wedding first, and he intended to take full responsibility. Although Yu was speechless, Dogok smiled and declared that there would indeed be a wedding. He thanked her for the incident and emphasized that her time was running out. If she didn't act soon, her sister would be the one standing next to him. Yu tensed, not wanting that outcome, and told him she understood. Dogok then invited her to have a meal with him, repeating the request when she hesitated. Yu, still uneasy, tried to refuse, claiming that she had her reasons for not eating with others. Dogok laughed, saying not to worry and that he would go first. He reached into his pocket and held out 2 bills, asking her to apologize properly for the kisses, the leaked photos, and the note. Tearing up the bills, he insisted that they should eat together, calling it the first condition of their wedding. The scene then shifted to a cafe where Yu looked around, unimpressed. She asked Dogok why food was the first condition for the wedding. He explained that if he hadn't insisted, they wouldn't be sitting together like this. Yu, frustrated, stared at the table. Dogok teased her, asking if the convenience store food was good enough for someone so squeamish. Yu, still irritated, admitted that at least the convenience store food didn't require her to check the cooking process.